Everyone, welcome back to FPL Fran. Today's video is going to be the Game Week 32 cheat sheet. Recording this video right after watching some Champions League football, and it's a little bit better today because I haven't been able to watch my actual team get spanked. Today we watched PSG and Barcelona, so some great goals all involved and some ramifications, I would say, from a Premier League point of view as well, just given that Aston Villa, our team, and Arsenal as well are likely to potentially rotate this week, regardless of the results, right? Yes, of course, Arsenal have a great lead. Aston Villa have a pretty large deficit, but you can imagine there's going to be rotation, given that the priority is going to be on the second legs still, and just making sure that their players are fit. As far as, let's say, Aston Villa specifically, I think this is a very tough week to sort of make statements on their players. I think someone like Rodgers, as we know, has played pretty much every single game this season. There's still a possibility, I think, that he can play, as absurd as it might be. As far as, let's say, players like Asensio and Rashford, I feel like there's things that have kind of changed against my sort of opinion. I knew Rashford was capable of playing minutes over Watkins, but I'm so surprised that Watkins barely got a sniff within the Champions League match. And so it seems quite unlikely that Rashford's going to start within the Premier League match, unless, let's say, the plans change in terms of the second leg for PSG. And when it comes to Asensio, we know that he was available to play versus PSG because there's no sort of similar kind of parent club clauses, I think, within the Champions League and European competition, but he wasn't starting as well within this first leg match. And so maybe Asensio now has a pretty good chance of starting Southampton. I think the implications of both these things are actually quite positive on the general outlook for the players within, let's say, Aston Villa. So that's why you'll see general rises. And even with Rodgers, I think, yes, whilst this game makes the most sense for him to be rotated, I think he very much deserves a rise. So when I look at the midfield tier, let's just get started with the budget tier. If you've never seen the cheat sheet series before, it's effectively a tier list of players going position to position, looking at the short to medium fixtures, the amount of fixtures, looking at the underlying data as well, and just generally fixture runs as well in terms of a qualitative standpoint. So Rodgers gets a rise in that sort of 5.x tier. We have Barnes as well being introduced. We got some comments from Howe, and I think actually it seems like a lot of the Newcastle journalists are in agreement with whatever Howe is suggesting to us, that maybe Gordon could be out indefinitely. I think that gives Barnes a lot of short-term appeal. Now, I don't know exactly how long indefinitely means for someone like Gordon, but if you kind of take faith into those comments, I think it should be a quite extensive period, hopefully, and that's really positive for Barnes, who can get a lot of minutes over this period, and clearly, you know, has been bought to play a big part in this club, and he gets to play his preferred left wing position. As far as someone like Rodgers, I think he's just so much more of a solid permanent pick. Another thing that I'd like to mention at this point is you can see the curve in terms of the fixtures, right? Everyone has very different strategies, whether you're free hitting a 33, 34, potentially even trying to save a 36. You need to kind of be cognizant that whatever players I'm tiering here, I'm still taking into account the fact that they have fixtures on 33 and 34. But some people blank, some people double right before they blank. And it just depends on what strategy you're on, what free hit you're on, whether you have a free hit at all, as to how you evaluate these players. Because let's say if you're on a 3 at 34 strategy, someone like Rodgers is amazing. If you're not potentially on, let's say, a 3 at 34 strategy and you're 3 at 33, then you might actually have the opposite sort of view on, let's say, some Aston Villa players. And that's something that you just need to take into account. The same sort of relationship you'll see with, you know, team players from Arsenal as well, as I mentioned from the outset. So try to look at the players that make the most sense from a team point of view for your strategy, I would say, and then you can kind of, I suppose, trust the veracity of this list. So let's say Minte, I think he deserves to be added to the sheet. He's just a very cheap option from a team like Brighton that I think can fit in quite well within the bench boost template. A lot of people are going for 3 at 34, so there's no interest in Brighton, I think, on a popular sort of, I guess, meta scale. But I still think that 3 at 33 is interesting, and Brighton players are deserving of being on the cheat sheet for that reason. And they have really good singular games when you look at the rest of the curve for the season, and specifically on Game Week 34 as well. So quite interesting in terms of a strategy point on Bench Boost 32, that some of these Brighton players can serve you well, I think, if you're going for some sort of 3 hit 33/36 strategy. Elanga gets a drop. I think the fixtures are now a bit worse now. Yes, Nottingham Forest have put in some really good performances consistently, and Elanga has been absolutely brilliant. But just in terms of, I guess, whether he sits on that sort of top 5 midfielders list right now in any sort of template, on any sort of chip strategy. I don't think he necessarily sits there, so that's why he gets a small little drop. Some of the games coming up are actually quite nice, but the nice games are away, and the home games are still quite tough. So I think Elanga makes sense if you've kept him all this time, but in terms of sort of looking at a recent buy, I think there's much less appeal there compared to some of the other picks that I've tiered as green in this tier. In the next tier, we have the 6.x players. Marino is probably due for a rotation at one point in time. I think he's played a lot of football, but equally, he is someone who can play multiple positions for this Arsenal team, and he has shown to be very good at playing out all these games and actually staying fit, whilst a lot of players have struggled to sort of do that. So I think the concern with Marino, even in the short term for a game like Brentford, is if you're expecting that players like Trossard and Nwaneri are going to play, then, and Sterling as well, then that's probably going to allow for Marino to play within the center mid position and play a little bit deeper, and that's going to be, unfortunately, a negative impact on him in Gaming 32. But the long-term view on Marino, in my opinion, is very, very strong, and that's why I feel very confident in having assessed him as having or being deserving of a rise over the last 2 weeks, and so feel good about that. Don't feel so good about him scoring versus Real Madrid, but it is what it is. Kluivert is where he's at. I think there's no need to put an asterisk on him right now because it seems like we've seen pictures of him in the gym. I think the only thing I can say is do stay tuned towards Irola's comments, and hopefully he's fit and available to play for most players. But I think he's had probably 2 weeks worth of rest now, so I would assume that he should be available to play. And these Bournemouth players honestly have a very strong influence on the rest of the season. With Semenyo, the reason why he's still in that orange tier is because there's actually still a chance in Game Week 32 specifically for him to get suspended because of the 10 yellow card impact. So for someone like Semenyo, the only thing I'll mention is that he's probably someone who's due a rise after a week like Game Week 32 because he's always been a very strong pick. He's a very stable pick, could have a chance of doubling at Game Week 36, and will finally have that suspension threat removed from him. As far as Asensio and Rashford, I sort of talked about that at the beginning of the video. So I feel like Asensio is an interesting case where I don't think he's nailed for any sort of particular reason. His minutes can be competing with a lot of the other players within the team. Has he been extremely high producing? Yes. Is it likely that he could start within the Premier League match? Yes, but then also it really depends on what Emery's preferred setup is for the second leg versus PSG, because arguably the initial setup, I suppose, today wasn't quite working. I don't know really if there's an actual Aston Villa team that can match up to this PSG team well. I think PSG are absurdly good. The way that they dominate control, how easy and effortless it is for some of the 3 out of 4 winger forward attackers to actually create chances on their own is quite mad, particularly when they're supported by some great fullbacks and an elite midfield. So, PSG aside, which is completely irrelevant to FPL, I think the consequence of Asensio and Rashford is that anyone going into these picks just needs to be wary that the rotation might not work out so well for Gaming 32, but going forwards, maybe actually their minutes could still be very strong Gaming 33 plus. With Asensio, I think it could be a bit weaker. Maybe I'm even tempted to make him an orange pick, but then I also think if you think he's not going to be part of the starting team versus PSG, then better minutes versus Southampton just means he's going to be an elite pick, because as we can see as we close out the season, getting a chance to play Southampton, getting a chance to play even Ipswich and Leicester to close out the season is very, very beneficial. There are some mega hauls on offer. Whether you actually get the player who gets the mega haul is a different question, right? I did miss out on Murphy, for example, but it's there for the taking. And so interesting sort of dual impact there. And for Rashford, I thought he would probably be maybe with waning minutes and filling in more in left wing type positions, but Watkins has really struggled to maintain minutes, and I don't think Emery has spoken too much about Watkins's availability, but we do know that he was coming off of a knock not too long ago, but the minutes just haven't really improved, right? The idea that I guess Rashford was holding for that position until Watkins has come back, I think could maybe be dusted now, and Rashford actually seems like he's just got really solid minutes, but things can change very, very quickly. Matoma gets added. I just think he's a bit expensive. Very much a niche pick in terms of any Brighton picks being relevant for strategies. It's very much for the non-meta strategy, I think, when it comes to free hits or a lack of a free hit. Martinelli, he gets a drop because I do think he'll get rotated in Gaming 32. But Jota, I think he gets added because he's actually got some really interesting fixtures. But once again, it's a case of if you have confidence in someone who's that injury prone, has been mostly out of form, but then did score quite recently versus Everton, Ultimately, Liverpool will have to see out the season. We have someone like Darwin who's also probably going to play quite extensive minutes. But I think he's an interesting pick, given that Liverpool actually has some really nice games in the short term that you can maybe chance if you have the opportunity to go for someone like Jota. And he actually fits really well with someone who doesn't have a free hit, right? It's a really strong standalone transfer despite the lack of doubles. Owen, really, really solid, but just for the Liverpool game, I think you can only really consider him probably 33 plus. And Mbumo's just a really solid pick. He is Arsenal, but I think the biggest thing that I'll have to mention is I think Mbumo is just far superior to Bowen as a pick because of some of the soft impacts like penalties and just generally speaking. Would I prefer to have Mbumo over Bowen? Probably yes, because of even little things like corners. And also, I would also just mention Mbumo just has elite finishing this season. And we just know he's had much better sort of chances this season compared to someone like Bowen, who I think historically has had much better expected goal involvement. And whilst Potter has improved this West Ham team, it was more so in defense, right? So I think with Mbumo, it just feels nicer to close the season with him, given that his fixtures are still probably overall better than Bowen's, particularly the kind of 36 to 38 aspect of things. But maybe I'm actually underrating Bowen a little bit. I think maybe it's unfair, but I would just mention that Bowen's a really strong pick. And yeah, I mean, he's also got Ipswich, final game of the season as well. So the big thing with someone like Mbumo, though, is if you are choosing one of these players, you're basically choosing either or. Mbumo himself has Ipswich and Wolves to close out the season. So I think they're very, very close in all actuality, but I would always rather take a penalty taker. So that's pretty much it. With Bruno, it's a similar kind of case as well. I probably think on balance, Bowen deserves to be a yellow, but it's also about me trying to make choices. I think with, let's say, Bruno, I think I also feel a little bit more confident there, partially due to penalties and things like that, and set pieces. So those kind of soft impacts that also have a huge contribution to bonus, I think are very relevant. Something that I'll mention about Bowen is he's not so good at creating bonus, creating actions compared to the likes of Mbumo, the likes of Bruno. So something to kind of mention there as well. With Foden, I put an asterisk around him. There's no injury. We know he's not injured. If anything, he's clearly suffering, I would say. Mentally, there's not much to speak about there. It's a form issue. I think Pep's cognizant of it. Are Man City playing excessively well without him? Not necessarily, right? Because they're also kind of weak as a team, and they'd probably prefer Foden sort of playing himself back into shape and form, but that's just not happening right now. So he's just going to remain exactly where he's at. And it's a bit of an odd case because a lot of people have moved Foden on early in anticipation of game week 33. And I'm not sure if his minutes right now look that great, but things can change very quickly. With Saka, Palmer, and Salah, I think Saka is very likely to maybe come off the bench in this Brentford match, but there's also the argument that Arsenal want to maintain some momentum. I think him taking a bit of a knock in that game probably makes me think that he'll probably play maybe another 45 minutes versus Brentford. That can kind of keep him in match shape for the Real Madrid second leg. For Palmer, this is the banker. I still haven't been able to watch, of course, the European Conference League games, the Europa League games, which will happen on Thursday. Hard to say how many minutes Palmer will play there, but I have to think that that one-time rest in the Premier League is not going to happen on a recurring basis, and I think it's still likely to expect that Palmer will start, although I was very, very shocked that Maresca still tried this rotation this late into the season, particularly when Chelsea actually have a huge need, I think, to secure top 5 themselves. And I think benching Jackson and Palmer isn't quite sensible. But that's it for the midfielders. It's a bit of a stale climate. I think there's a lot of options that you can kind of mix and match with in terms of the 5.x and 6.x tier. Another thing that I'll probably point out is I think there are still a lot of kind of X-Mins risks, right? The likes of Savinho, Asensio, Rashford, even Jota, for example, that I've added are very representative of that. Foden as well. Would I really recommend those picks necessarily myself? No, I'd prefer going for more stable, nailed options like the likes of Rodgers. So that's just a qualitative point, and that's what kind of my own general FPL point of view. In terms of that tier of players between Bowen, Bruno, and Fernandes, I would probably pick Mbumo for sure, and that's because he's just rock solid. In the forward tier, we have a couple changes. João Pedro getting a soft drop. It seems like he's clearly struggling with either some sort of knock or fatigue or just the travel sort of impacts as well. He's now got a week of rest, and I think it's very likely he should still start versus Leicester, but not good to see that even whilst Rutter is injured, that he's been struggling to get minutes. And I think it's not because of form or anything. He clearly sort of played himself back into form and was actually playing really well before the international break, but is a player who clearly doesn't struggle from getting, I guess, consistently injured and struggling on that basis. And Evan Nelson has just gone from strength to strength. He scored a lot of goals recently. Underlying stats, not exceptional, but with the kind of, recent kind of lack of bodies available for this Bournemouth team, it just means he's got really, really good minutes outlooks. And that's a huge positive for Evan Nelson too. And simply he's in form. I think maybe 2-3 weeks ago, I would have probably said that these are close to 50-50 picks. Provided the João Pedro's actually fit, I think I'd still actually make the assessment that they're 50-50, but I don't have that information right now, so it's hard to say. In terms of the 6.x tier, I've actually got Wisa now paired with Cunha as a top option. I think Cunha coming back, you've got a really good game here. Tottenham at home, Leicester at home in the distance. Quite interesting, particularly for a 3-33 strategy, as I mentioned. The issue, of course, is a lot of people are on the 3-34 strategy, and that means you're going to exclude the Leicester at home game from the calendar. And so these kind of evaluations, as I said, are very critical if you just try to look at your chip strategy. Maybe just be aware of what the impacts would be on your own strategy. As far as, let's say, the other tiers of players, I actually probably wanted to take Watkins out of the cheat sheet, but look, he could very well start in the Southampton match, especially if Rashford is the preferred striker right now for the team. And in terms of sort of if you wanted to make an A team, B team type of assessment of this Aston Villa squad right now. And so that's a huge positive for Watkins, and inevitably in a double game week, he's going to play really good minutes, I think, over the course of it compared to people who have singles. So I think Watkins is still a strong pick, but he's not where I think I would have expected him to be a couple of weeks ago. And I think there is a fair point to say that his X-Men outlooks currently look really, really poor. In defense, the only changes that I've really made is a little bit of a change to the guard with assessment to Arsenal. I think Kyrgios played really, really well. I think it's very likely that the backline this weekend is going to be Kiwior and Saliba, because it's most likely that Calafiori is not fit. I find it very hard to believe that Kiwior would actually get benched, so I actually think that Saliba might be prone to getting benched. But I also struggle to sort of name who would be benching Saliba, even though he's played a lot of minutes, because I think someone like Timber, for example, who's, I suppose, capable of doing that, has also really struggled with minutes so far. He's always someone who struggles to play the full 90 minutes, always cramps at some point in time before the full 90 minutes. So I feel like Timber is always most likely to be subbed off, as he was late in the game versus Real Madrid. And that means White is very, very likely to play on the weekend, which is also why Timber is very, very low on the list. The reason why I'm talking about Arsenal as a whole, because I think it's just important to kind of explain what I think about the back lines. However, going for Kira makes a lot of sense for a lot of people on the dominant 3-34 strategy, because you're probably going to get a start versus Brentford at home, which is still a really, really good match. And then in Gaming 33, I actually think he's actually very likely to play both the matches in the double. And that's huge. With Dunk, I think he fits the opposite strategy, more of a 3-33 strategy. So some of the changes that you can see for these Brighton players is very much specific to that, right? Really good game in Gaming 34, really good game in Gaming 32, an exceptional game even. And yeah, a good point that a friend Mark, who made that after discussing with another manager that I really respect in FPL Spaceman, basically mentioned that most of the Brighton backline is not actually comprised of defenders right now. So it's actually very likely that someone like Dunk or Estupiñán will get really good bonus if they get that almost guaranteed clean sheet versus Leicester. I don't know how many matches in a row Leicester have not scored, but they don't look any closer to scoring. And Ruud van Nistelrooy is still in charge, and nothing's going to change about that team. So is it possible that going into Brighton this week, this is the week that Leicester score? Yes. But is it an amazing opportunity to get a clean sheet and maybe a super haul from a defender? I think also yes. So yeah, that's why these Brighton players have gotten a boost. But keep in mind, not so great if you're in a 3-34 strategy. Nico Williams still a very strong pick. Other changes here would be me adding Ruben to the sheet. Ruben just seems like he's maybe due for one potential resting if Kushyanov is back, and he's liable to it, I think, just given his age and sometimes his own struggles with the fitness as well. Ruben has not played too many minutes over the last 2 seasons, but inevitably I think he's still a really solid Man City pick. And I think we've clearly shown and seen that the midfield has given us a lot of struggles with Foden and Savinho not playing the minutes that we'd like week to week, and that's just something to think about. Otherwise, within the sort of defense, the kind of climate is that you have a lot of players in 33 who actually have really good fixtures on paper on 36 as well. Teams like maybe Aston Villa, not so much, I would say, because the fixtures in 33 aren't great from a clean sheet perspective. Another thing too is so many of the Arsenal and Aston Villa players are always still having a small percentage chance of getting rotated. I just think it's unlikely, as I said, that someone like Kiwi or Saliba would get rotated, but it's more so the likes of players like Timber, maybe even Konsa, for example, who can get rotated. And you just need to sort of pay respects to that if you have these sorts of players in your team. Not that I really think there's a need to move any of them on, particularly Saliba as well, who I think is still most likely to play in the weekend. As far as the goalkeepers, just to round off quickly, I've just dropped Kepa. It's just more so a case of the fixtures in the short term aren't particularly good. Yes, 36 could be a great double. And if you own him, you own him. There's nothing you're going to change about that. But to close out most of the games in the future, we still have doubles from Henderson and Pope, Raya as well, and Ederson, whilst interesting. And to be fair, Ederson is actually quite interesting because, as I said, there's such a struggle with picking triple Man City. So there's a lot of sense, I think, towards going for someone like Ederson on a Game Week 33 if you actually are in need of a double Game Week goalkeeper at one point in time for Game Week 33. So that's the only thing I'll probably mention right now. The cheat sheet's a little bit stagnant in terms of defense and goalkeepers, but I think there's a lot of moves in terms of the midfield and forward positions that can hopefully spice things up. And once again, I have to go back to that point that I've been hashing out over the entirety of this episode, but just pay attention to the chip strategy you're on. Be aware that multiple chip strategies can work, and if you're planning towards your own chip strategy, that the best thing to do is to commit to it, as opposed to looking at what everyone else has in terms of their sort of template picks and things like that. So otherwise, I hope you guys have a wonderful week and enjoy the football.